If you were to go to your friends and neighbors and say to them, listen, do you want to go to church with me tonight? Notwithstanding COVID, let's imagine for a moment that there's no COVID and that the churches are all open and everybody can attend properly. If you were to go to one of your friends or neighbors tonight and say to them, listen, why don't you come to church with me? Or go to them and say, I'd like to tell you about Jesus, what do you suppose they would say to you? If you've had any experience with that, you'll know how difficult that can be in a province like New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, PEI, and perhaps throughout Canada, maybe even in America. Why is that? Why do people shun it so much? And if we look at the statistics, the attendance in churches is dropping way down in the Western countries while it's rising in the East. The problem within the church itself is there's just no power. Why would anybody want to go there? It has become a way of life, the church in general. And there's very little interest in the church system. There's very little interest from people simply because they've heard it before. What is interesting that I have found in the past few weeks is the answer from, or the lack of answer from members in our own community regarding the posts that I have put on Facebook lately and on YouTube and on my website. And the response has been absolutely silence. I've contacted a couple of churches. I've asked them, what do you think? There's not even a response. I mean, there's not even, well, good luck. There's nothing. It's just silence, total silence. We have a tendency to look at missions or that kind of work as something that's for a select few. We go through all of these rituals. It's a formalistic kind of way of living out the Christian life and saying, well, this is what Christians do, right? They get together, they sing, they dance, they have a good time, they eat dinner, and they all head out to Pizza Hut later on. Again, notwithstanding COVID and all that. But generally, that's how I was raised in the small community. And if anybody ever talked about missions, it was so far removed from my own reality that it just didn't register at all. I mean, how do you tell somebody, well, look, these little children are starving over in Ethiopia. Like, what are you going to do about it? I have no idea. What could I even possibly arrange to help these children, Or if you're sitting at home and you are having dinner with your parents and you leave something on the table, and I don't know how many, I've heard it a few times, like there's kids starving in Africa, right? And I said, well, maybe we'll box this, chicken bone up and send it over or something. And so there wasn't really any kind of a serious consideration of these things. It wasn't something that I thought about personally. And I don't think even within our church, I don't think we thought about it much. But that's not 100% accurate because our pastor was in touch with people that were in other countries. And I think perhaps maybe we sponsored a missionary, or what we call a missionary, somebody over in some far-flung country that we will never meet, we didn't know and never received any reports from. And anyway, we sent them the money because that's what Christians do, right? We have our little agenda, and to throw in for good measure, we make sure that we've got a few poor people on the roster to keep things equally balanced out, right? That probably sounds a little harsh. I don't mean to sound too critical of it all, but, I was in a church for a long time, and we went through all these steps, and even when I moved on to other places of assembly, it wasn't much different. It's very insular, where people are thinking about their own salvation, their own position or standing with the Lord, and we talk about blessings, and we talk about how God answered my prayer today for a parking space, or a brand new set of curtains or something. I don't know. It's just very simple, basic stuff usually. And occasionally you'll hear a miracle story where somebody has been healed, or they receive some form of direction by apparent divine means. And so there's always that element of it, that there were incidences that would encourage us in our faith and to keep us moving forward and so forth. But I think for the most part, my experience has been anyway, and you might not agree with me, but this is how I see it. My experience has been generally is that people are trained up in these religions and basically adopt whatever it is that has been passed down through generations, whether through their grandparents, their parents, or perhaps a brother or sister, or even friends that we meet along the way, who become a strong influence to us and invite us eventually into a church service where we join their group and get baptized, and which is a commandment. But generally, we follow the status quo and do what we think we ought to be doing as Christians, and that is, we can't be shouting at people and swearing at the dog or the neighbors and telling people where to get off, even though we feel like it and whatnot. But when it comes to actual outreach, what we used to call outreach in the church, where we would supposedly bring the gospel to people, it wasn't much of an outreach. We would sit in our kitchens, probably nervous, before going across the street and talking to the old man or the old woman there who was ready to die and saying, "Listen, are you ready to meet God in the sky?" And that was our form of evangelism. Now, you'll meet people who are very influential in the circles of church, and we could all name a few of them who are very effective, I would say, in just changing lives and in a positive way. On the other hand, and here's what I'm sort of driving at, I brought these posts out recently of a person in Africa who travels across just treacherous terrain, and with no water, I would say, for miles, and he goes into these villages to preach to people and to build schools and to help children and to talk to villagers who are clearly not as well off as he is. And he does all of this for free. And I thought, well, this is, here's a definite need. The guy is working among militant groups and he's in danger most of the time, but he still does it, and he believes in God and he trusts in what he's doing and that he will be led accordingly. And so I thought, well, this kind of person needs some support. I mean, if nothing else, he's trying to build a school, and that should be enough in itself to say, well, look, why don't we give the guy a hand? I mean, $25, that's what I thought. Let's each person kick in $25, help the guy drive to this place, which is a 14-hour journey, by the way, just to bring in school books and hold a gospel crusade. The response has been less than overwhelming, I must say. In fact, I have received what they call zero response. And nobody, a couple of people, but usually what I hear is this: well, we have a lot of needs in our own country. Why get involved here? Well, that's a good question. If you're actually out there getting involved in your community, it's really not what you call evangelism. It's a lifestyle, and it's a thing that we do, I think, to assuage our own conscience, to make sure that we can convince ourselves that we're actually doing what Jesus has commanded us to do, and that is to go into all nations and to preach the gospel. And so we do these little actions, and it sort of gives us that peace of mind. And, well, I told my bus driver today, well, you should come to church with me sometime. And do you know Jesus, and so forth. And all of that has its own place, and it does work for some people. But the reason that people aren't being drawn into the assembly is simply because there's no power. There's just absolutely little power that goes on in these places. And what happens, he said himself, look up and look onto the fields that they're already ripe to harvest, they're already white to harvest, and pray that the Lord would send forth laborers into his harvest. This is Jesus himself asking us and asking you, pray that somebody will go. Somebody will stand up and say, I'll go work in your field. Very few people will actually get up and go. Why is that? Well, I'm not called into Africa. I'm not called into India. I don't want to end up in, some remote tribe in the middle of a jungle and trying to convince pygmies that they ought to be believing in Jesus when I don't even know who I am, you know? And so we just stay where we are at and we live our lives in a comfortable zone. And we say to those who ask, look, why don't you get involved? And they say, well, we have needs in our own backyard. You know, really, you have needs in your own backyard. Well, go take a walk out to your backyard and see how many people are actually under the gun there. Are you that poor that you can't afford $25? Seriously, tell me about it. I can't afford $25. Do you honestly believe that if you gave $25 towards the Lord's work, that he wouldn't actually return that to you? And I'm not into that whole thing where you say, well, I'll give $10 and get back 20. Because you'll hear that from ministers online quite often. Those people are out to shaft you. They're out to shear the sheep. Say, well, look, you know, I'm an online ministry here. I'm a televangelist. Send me, I need to buy a new airplane. And if you do that, God will, and you have people, God will bless you. This is what they say. And you have people who actually have zero money, who cannot pay their hydro bill, who send off their last $100 to this guy because they believe that somehow Jesus is going to rescue them from their financial woes. What I'm saying here is that when you give, it's not something that you have to take and say, well, look, you know, I'm going to take this food out of my child's mouth and give it to that brother who has no food, because then, you know, that doesn't work either, because then your kid goes hungry and somebody else is fed. Whatever abundance you and I have, that abundance can be used to further God's kingdom. That's missions. That's what that's about. That He's calling people to direct them to take your resources and to use it for the gospel, for helping people that are poor, for heaven's sakes. How much? It's just so fundamental that if you see a brother or sister naked, destitute in this world, and you're not moved, your bowels of compassion are not moved to assist that brother or to feed that brother, bring them medicine or bring them help or to relieve their burdens, how can you call yourself a Christian? How can you say, I believe in Jesus Christ, when the whole thing that he did was to do that, was to alleviate suffering, was to help the helpless? He didn't go to the scribes and the Pharisees and the rulers of the day. If he did, he was there and they had a battle. They were the ones that ended up crucifying him. He's the one that set the example. He washed the feet of his own disciples. Do you really need to be called? You are already called.